Bernie Flanagan knew long before she hit her late 20s that blending in offered far fewer hazards than standing out. At 28, her generous figure felt like a burdensome cloak. Rounded back and avoiding gaze were her defenses against a world obsessed with thinness. Following a job relocation that took her to Ponderosa City, Bernie secretly hoped this could become a clean slate, but negativity followed her through the company offices like static cling. "Check out the blimp," she overheard someone mutter under their breath as she made her way down the aisle on her first day. The statement stung, but Bernie kept walking toward her desk, her messenger bag secured tightly. She'd dealt with worse. So much worse, actually. What no one realized was that beneath the plus-size clothing and timid disposition resided an entirely different woman. For the last 8 years, Bernie had studied Aikido at the Okami Dojo in her hometown, where her sensei, Mrs. Nakamura, had taught her that strength originates within. She had achieved a second-degree black belt, her movements possessing the ability to incapacitate assailants much larger than herself. Yet here, in these modern offices consumed with shallow judgments, she felt like a sitting duck. The employee break room turned into her initial testing ground. Bernie sat by herself, gently stirring her coffee while chatter vibrated all around her. That's when she noticed she was being watched. A trio of women from the marketing department, their eyes fixed on her with a sense of amusement. The ringleader was Tiffany Sterling, a stunning redhead whose self-assurance came from never having to struggle. Her groupies, Brandy Jenkins and Kimberly Stewart, followed her lead, their designer outfits and salon hairstyles setting them apart. "Goodness, she's practically overflowing out of that chair," Tiffany said loudly enough for people at nearby tables to hear. "Maybe she ought to bring in a recliner from home then." Giggles spread through their little group, and Bernie felt her face grow warm. She longed to vanish, to merge into the floor tiles and never be seen again. Instead, she calmly finished her coffee, gathering her belongings while the whispers intensified. "Seriously, who authorized the release of the Zeppelin?" Brandy's voice carried across the room. Bernie's hands trembled slightly as she rose, but she avoided looking their way. She just couldn't, because if she turned around, if she let them see the boiling anger rising within her, things would change permanently. Mrs. Nakamura's words resonated in her head. "A true warrior knows when to avoid conflict, Bernie-san. Preserve your energy for when it truly matters." But with each passing day, it became harder to ignore them. Tiffany and her posse appeared to have made it their personal mission to torment Bernie, turning the simple act of coming to work into a daily test. They'd accidentally block her path in the hallways, spilling her papers while offering phony apologies. They'd make pointed remarks about her physique whenever she walked by, their voices saturated with insincere concern. "Someone really needs to educate her on portion control," Kimberly would say, loud enough for Bernie to catch it. "Maybe she doesn't realize there are entire clothing stores besides the plus-size sections," Tiffany would contribute, her companions erupting into laughter. The office gym became their next venue of harassment. During company wellness activities, whenever Mr. Henderson wasn't watching closely, they'd make sure Bernie understood her place in their hierarchy. During team sports, she was always chosen last, met with exaggerated groans and eye rolls. When they jogged on the treadmills, Tiffany would run next to her, providing running commentary. "Keep going, Bernie, you can do it. Just imagine there's a buffet at the finish line." The other employees watched with the passive interest of spectators at a performance. Some looked uncomfortable, but nobody spoke up in her defense. Nobody intervened. They were all too relieved it wasn't them in Tiffany's sights. Bernie absorbed it all in silence, her teeth clenched and fists jammed into her pockets. At night, she'd lie awake replaying every taunt, every cruel comment, every instance when she had opted to walk away rather than confront them. The reasons for her self-control were simple, but powerful. She was new, she was outnumbered, and she was tired of being seen as the problem wherever she went. Fighting back would only validate what they already thought about her, that she was peculiar, aggressive, someone to be feared rather than accepted. But more than that, she was frightened of what she might do if she lost control. In the dojo, controlled self-defense was a discipline. In the offices of Ponderosa City, it would be chaos. The final straw occurred on a Wednesday morning in late September. Bernie had worked at Ponderosa for almost 2 months, and the bullying had developed into a predictable routine. She'd learned to maneuver around Tiffany's group, to use different routes between meetings, to eat lunch at her desk instead of the break room. She actually thought she'd found a way to endure. She was mistaken. That morning, she'd worn her favorite blouse, a flowing emerald green top that her sister had bought for her birthday. It was among the few articles of clothing that made her feel attractive, that reminded her she was more than just a number on a scale. She'd even left her auburn hair loose around her shoulders instead of wearing it in its typical braid. Tiffany noticed instantly. "Well, well, well," she said, cutting off Bernie's path to the supply room. "Look who decided to doll herself up today. You got a hot date tonight, Bernie? Is there actually someone desperate enough to—" "Just leave me alone, Tiffany," Bernie interrupted, her voice almost inaudible. "What was that?" Tiffany pretended to strain her ears. "I couldn't quite hear you over the sound of your thighs rubbing together." Brandy and Kimberly surrounded her, creating a wall of mockery. Other employees began to slow down, sensing something exciting was about to unfold. Bernie felt the familiar heat of humiliation creeping up her neck, but something else was rising as well, something darker and stronger. "I said leave me alone," she repeated, louder this time, her voice echoing slightly in the hall. Tiffany's eyes gleamed with cruel pleasure. "Oh, she's getting feisty now. Ladies, I think our little whale is trying to get tough." "Maybe she thinks she's intimidating," Brandy added with a snicker. "The only thing intimidating here is her wardrobe selection," Kimberly chimed in. "Did she raid a circus tent?" The hallway erupted in laughter. Bernie stood paralyzed in the center of it all, her chest heaving with rapid breaths. She could feel every gaze fixed on her, could hear every snide remark and snicker. This was it. This was the moment she'd been dreading and preparing for over the past several weeks. "You know what?" Tiffany stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more threat than her shouting. "I'm tired of pretending to be nice. You repulse me. Every time I look at you, I feel sick. You're a walking disaster, and everybody around here knows it." The words struck her like physical blows, each one carefully aimed to inflict maximum damage. Bernie felt something shatter inside her chest, a wall she'd built to protect herself from exactly this kind of attack. The painstakingly constructed boundaries between her two lives, the Aikido practitioner and the victim, began to crumble. "Cat got your tongue," Tiffany pressed. "What's the matter? Too busy thinking about your next snack?" That's when Bernie's posture began to shift. It was subtle at first, a barely perceptible straightening of her back, a redistribution of her weight that provided a more stable stance. Her hands, which had been gripping her messenger bag straps, gradually relaxed to her sides. She raised her head, and for the first time in nearly 2 months, she looked Tiffany Sterling directly in the eye. "Are you finished?" Bernie asked, her voice steady and calm in a way that caused Tiffany to take an unconscious step backward. "What did you just say to me?" "I asked if you were finished." Bernie's voice carried a new tone, something that made the laughter in the hallway begin to fade away. "Because I've been tolerating your comments for weeks now, and I'm starting to believe you might be the one with the problem." Tiffany's face flushed red. "You fat cow, how dare you?" "There it is," Bernie interrupted, a faint smile appearing at the corners of her mouth. "Your true colors. You know, Tiffany, you talk a lot about how I look, but at least I don't have to tear other people down to feel good about myself." The hallway had fallen completely silent now. Employees pressed closer, their cell phones appearing as they sensed something important was about to happen. Tiffany looked around wildly, suddenly realizing that the narrative had shifted and she was no longer in control. "You think you're tough now?" Tiffany's voice cracked slightly. "You think because you finally grew a spine, you can talk to me like that?" "I think," Bernie said, taking a step forward, "that you're about to discover precisely how tough I can be." The transformation was dramatic and instantaneous. Where a moment before stood a hunched, apologetic woman, now stood someone entirely different. Bernie's shoulders squared, her feet planted in a stance that conveyed years of training. Her eyes, which had spent weeks avoiding contact, now locked onto Tiffany with laser-like focus. "You want to continue talking?" Bernie asked, her voice echoing through the hallway like a challenge. "Or are you ready to back up all that talk?" Tiffany looked to her friends for support, but Brandy and Kimberly had turned pale, sensing something dangerous in the atmosphere. The other employees formed a loose circle, their phones recording everything. "I don't fight pigs," Tiffany said, but her voice trembled slightly. "No," Bernie agreed, "you just torment them until they can't take it anymore." "But here's the thing, Tiffany. I'm not a pig. I'm not your target. And I'm certainly not afraid of you." Tiffany made her critical mistake then. Whether it was arrogance, fear, or sheer stupidity, she lunged forward with her hand raised, aiming for Bernie's face. It was a clumsy, untrained swipe that telegraphed itself from a mile away. Bernie moved with fluid grace. She sidestepped the awkward attack, seized Tiffany's wrist, and used the redhead's own momentum to spin her around. Before anyone could blink, Tiffany was pinned against the wall, her arm twisted behind her back in a wrist lock that had her gasping in pain. "Let go of me," Tiffany shrieked, but her voice was muffled by the wall. "You wanted a confrontation," Bernie said calmly, applying just enough pressure to make her point. "This is a confrontation. How do you like it?" Kimberly made the mistake of rushing forward to assist her friend. Bernie released Tiffany and moved to intercept the attack, her body flowing through movements that had been ingrained in her for years. A swift palm strike to Kimberly's chest dropped her to her knees, gasping for breath. Brandy, seeing her two friends neutralized in seconds, backed away with her hands raised. "Please," she stammered, "we didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," Bernie cut her off. "You meant every word, every sneer, every time you made me feel worthless. You meant all of it." Tiffany had recovered enough to turn around, her face flushed with humiliation and rage. "You crazy bitch, I'll have you fired, You'll what?" Bernie stepped closer, and Tiffany instinctively pressed back against the wall. "You'll tell everyone how the fat woman you've been tormenting for weeks just handed you your ass? You'll explain to your parents how you got beaten up by someone you called a pig?" The hallway was dead silent, except for Kimberly's ragged breathing. Every employee watched in awe as the company's social hierarchy crumbled before their very eyes. Tiffany Sterling, untouchable Queen Bee, was cowering against a wall while her victim stood over her like a conquering hero. "Here's what's going to happen," Bernie continued, her voice never rising above a conversational tone. "You're going to leave me alone, all of you. You're going to find someone else to amuse yourselves with because I'm done being your entertainment. You can't just—" Tiffany started. "I can do whatever I want," Bernie interrupted. "That's the funny thing about respect, Tiffany. You can't demand it, you can't buy it, you can't bully people into giving it to you. You have to earn it." She turned to address the crowd that had gathered. "That goes for all of you. Almost 2 months I've worked here, and not one of you said a word when they were tearing me down. You all just watched, relieved it wasn't you. Well, now you know, I don't need your protection. I never did." Tiffany tried one last desperate tactic, lunging at Bernie's back. It was another amateur mistake. Bernie heard her coming, spun around, and delivered a perfect leg sweep that sent her sprawling across the hallway floor. Tiffany lay there for a moment, stunned, blood trickling from her nose. "Stay down," Bernie advised. "I won't tell you again." Tiffany looked up at her, and for the first time Bernie saw something besides cruelty in her eyes. Fear. Genuine, honest fear of what she had unleashed. "You're insane," Tiffany whispered. "No," Bernie replied. "I'm exhausted. Exhausted of being your victim. Exhausted of being afraid. Exhausted of pretending I'm something I'm not." She glanced around at the crowd of employees, their phones still recording, their faces showing a mix of shock and awe. "My name is Bernice Flanagan. I'm 28 years old, I weigh 260 pounds, and I'm a second-degree black belt in Aikido. I've been training to defend myself since I was 20, and I'm good at it, really good." She turned back to Tiffany, who was slowly getting to her feet. "You picked the wrong woman to harass, Tiffany. You thought because I was overweight, because I was quiet, because I was new, that I was weak. You were mistaken." "This isn't over," Tiffany said, but the fight had drained from her voice. "Yes, it is," Bernie corrected. "It's been over since the moment you threw that first punch. Everything after this is just you learning to live with the results." Mr. Harrison, the HR manager, appeared at the end of the hallway, drawn by the commotion. "What is going on here?" The employees scattered like frightened birds, but Bernie stood her ground. Tiffany and her friends also remained, looking battered and humiliated. "Just a misunderstanding, Mr. Harrison," Bernie said calmly. "We were resolving it." Mr. Harrison looked between the women, taking in Tiffany's bloody nose and disheveled appearance, Kimberly still clutching her chest, and Bernie standing calm and composed in the middle of it all. "Miss Sterling, do you require medical attention?" Tiffany looked at Bernie, then at the HR manager, then back at Bernie. "No, sir, I'm fine." "Good. All of you, get back to work. And if I hear about any more disturbances, there will be repercussions for everyone involved." As the HR manager walked away, Tiffany leaned close to Bernie. "You think you've accomplished something here?" "I think I've terminated something here," Bernie replied. "The question is, are you intelligent enough to let it stay terminated?" Tiffany stared at her for a long moment, then walked away without another word. Kimberly and Brandy followed, casting nervous glances back at Bernie. The remainder of the day passed in a whirlwind of whispered conversations and sideways glances. By lunchtime, the story had circulated throughout the entire company, growing and changing with each retelling. Bernice Flanagan, the quiet plus-size woman, had single-handedly taken down the most popular clique in the office. But the true change was in how people regarded her. The mocking glances were gone, replaced by something else: respect, curiosity, and in some cases fear. Bernie sat in the break room for the first time since her second day, eating her lunch while employees gave her a wide berth. She wasn't invisible anymore, but she wasn't a target either. She was simply Bernice Flanagan, and that was enough. Tiffany and her friends sat at their usual table, but the atmosphere had shifted. Tiffany kept her head down, her movements subdued. The other marketing employees sensed the shift in power and began to distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with weakness. 2 weeks later, Tiffany approached Bernie at her desk. Gone was the aggressive posture, the cruel smirk, the entourage. She stood alone, looking somehow smaller. "I wanted to apologize," Tiffany said quietly. Bernie looked at her, taking in the genuine remorse in her eyes. "For what, exactly?" "For everything. For being cruel. For making your life miserable. For ... Tiffany struggled with the words. "For being everything I despise about myself." "Why?" Bernie asked. "Why did you single me out?" Tiffany was silent for a long moment. "Because you were different. Because you were new. Because ... She took a shaky breath. "Because I was envious." "Envious?" "You didn't care what anyone thought. You were just yourself. And I've spent so many years trying to be what everyone else wanted me to be that I forgot who I really was." Tiffany's voice cracked slightly. "I took it out on you because I couldn't take it out on myself." Bernie studied her former tormentor, seeing her clearly for the first time. Beneath the designer clothes and perfect hair was a woman just as lost and frightened as she had been. "I accept your apology," Bernie said finally, "but that doesn't mean we're friends." "I know," Tiffany nodded. I needed you to know that I'm sorry, and that I'm trying to improve." She walked away, leaving Bernie alone with her thoughts. The woman who had made her life miserable was gone, replaced by someone who seemed almost human. It was a reminder that everyone was fighting battles that others couldn't see. The rest of the year passed quietly. Bernie never had to fight again, but everyone knew she could. She befriended other employees who had been on the margins, forming a group of misfits who looked out for one another. She started an Aikido self-defense class at the company, becoming a popular instructor and empowering others to stand up for themselves. On the day of the company holiday party, as she walked into the ballroom, Bernie caught sight of Tiffany across the room. Their eyes met for a moment, and Tiffany gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't friendship, but it was something. After the party, Bernie's sensei, Mrs. Nakamura, called her. "I heard you had some issues at your new workplace," she said with a knowing tone. "Just had to remind someone that respect isn't automatically granted. It must be earned," Bernie replied. "And do you remember what I taught you about being a warrior?" Bernie thought about it. That true strength isn't about hurting others. It's about protecting yourself and those around you. It's about knowing when to engage and when to withdraw. "And when do you engage, Bernie-san?" "When withdrawing is no longer a viable option," she answered. "When someone needs to understand that actions have consequences." Mrs. Nakamura nodded approvingly. "You have learned well. But remember, the strongest person in the room is often the one who has no need to demonstrate it." As Bernie drove home that evening, she reflected on the woman she'd been when she first arrived at Ponderosa City. Afraid, alone, desperate to blend in. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who knew her worth and wouldn't let anyone convince her otherwise. She'd learned that bullies were fundamentally cowards, that they preyed on people they perceived as weak because they were weak themselves. She'd learned that sometimes you had to fight to find peace, that sometimes self-defense was the only language certain people understood. But most importantly, she'd learned that she was never as powerless as she'd believed. The strength had always been there, waiting for the appropriate moment to surface. All she'd needed was the courage to use it. The plus-size woman who'd been everyone's target was gone. In her place stood Bernice Flanagan, Aikido practitioner, protector, and survivor. And she was precisely who she was meant to be. Characters: 20,627.